Tim, now we approach the part of the story that I'm particularly curious about, and this is these mysterious men from the East. We call them the three wise men, the three kings. Who were they really, and what was their true role?
I like the way you say that. Who were they really? Because you're catching on to how I do things. The first misconception we need to correct is that there weren't three and they weren't kings.
Tim, Christmas cards clearly depict three.
I know, but we get that from the three gifts, the gold, the frankincense, and the myrrh. And this is a scenario where we can actually track the development of the tradition over time. We're going to talk about who they really were and stuff like that, but bear with me for just a second and we'll look at this tradition, because by the 3rd century, we were told they were kings. Up until then, no one called them a king, but then by the 3rd century, they were called kings. By the 8th century, we had given them names. And then as it went even further, they were assigned certain parts of the globe that they were supposed to represent. And then finally, by the time you get to the 19th century, well, that's when the famous American Christmas Carol was written, We Three Kings of Orient Are.
So this depiction of three men of mixed nationalities and age, just like the rest of this, the truth is different than the story.
Of course it is. I mean, it's a tradition, and that's great. You know, I'm not here to wreck people's traditions necessarily, but as is often the case with documentaries, if you see a documentary about any famous person, pretty much right at the beginning they say, well, the legend goes like this, but the truth is a little different, and that's the same thing here.
Okay, well, where do we start? Who are the wise men? What is their origin?
Okay, well, the wise men started almost like a side story in a way, because initially they were simply one tribe among the Medes. See, we've talked about the Medes before.
The Medo-Persians.
Exactly. Well, even prior to that, because the Medes initially were an independent kingdom, then they were dominated by the Assyrians, then they were an independent kingdom again for a little brief time, and by the time you get to the Babylonian Empire, the Magians, who were simply one tribe among the Medes, had become their hereditary priesthood, very similar to what the Levites did among the Jews. They were the hereditary priesthood. So by this time, the Babylonian Empire, in addition to being the hereditary priesthood of their own empire, they had started to serve in the Babylonian courts and had already developed a reputation for profound spiritual knowledge, which is why we mentioned in a previous segment, by the time we get to Daniel, the title Mag or Magian already represented wise men in this fashion.
I'm guessing you have a great example of this.
Of course we do, and it's right out of the Bible. We all know the story from having gone to Sunday school. When the Babylonians conquered the southern kingdom of Judah, they took captives, and among these captives were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and of course their friend Daniel. And then Daniel interprets this dream for Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar appoints him Rabmag, which in Aramaic means the chief of the Magi. So, I mean, there we have it. Daniel's duty was to give an intelligence briefing to the king every day, and that would include all forms of knowledge. I mean, these guys were court officials, there were royal tutors, they would teach the king's children. That was the kind of jobs they had. So they covered mathematics, they covered science, they covered medicine, and a lot of other stuff as well.
Extraordinary.
They really are. These are some amazing individuals, and they play a really unique role in our story, way beyond the stereotypical three kings.
Tim, let's revisit this idea that the Magi were master dream interpreters as well. That's interesting to me.
Absolutely, because Daniel was promoted because of his demonstrated ability to interpret dreams. And I know this may sound really bizarre, frankly, in our modern day and time when we think about scientific knowledge, but back then, that was scientific knowledge. The ability to interpret dreams was considered extremely important, especially among royalty and nobility. And we're going to see this resurface again during the Nativity story, because when the Magi arrive in Jerusalem and then go to Bethlehem, They're warned by God in a dream not to go back to Jerusalem and see Herod, but to return to go home another way.
So, Tim, the Magi, among all of their skills, they were the master dream interpreters on the planet.
Yes, they were.
Tim, the Magi had this profound spiritual, mystical knowledge. How would you describe it?
Well, we don't use these words very often anymore, but the words we would use to describe their skill set is we would call it esoteric or arcane. You used the word mysterious a moment ago, or mystical, because while their knowledge was rooted and grounded in hard science and history most of the time, it tended to flirt with the threshold of spiritual knowledge, like we just said. So they played this very interesting dual religious and political role, because back in this day and age, that was what knowledge was. That was how learning worked, is there wasn't this hard line necessarily between the natural sciences and then spiritual issues. They were kind of all lumped together.
I get that. I was trying to think how to phrase this. To me, it almost reminds me of mystical science, for lack of a better term. But what were the hard sciences? What were their other skills that they had?
Well, like I said earlier, they were into math. They were mathematicians. They understood medicine. And one of their big ones is they were astronomers. And the astronomy of that day was largely math-based. It's pretty interesting looking into the ancient astronomy of other cultures.
And the Magi were master astronomers.
Absolutely, because that brings us to a topic that we call Archaeoastronomy.
Let's define that. I've heard the term, and especially used in other cultures, but for our audience, describe what that is.
Okay, Archaeoastronomy, very simply, is what ancient cultures knew and understood and believed about astronomy. So in our story, we're looking at the archaeoastronomy of the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Judeans.
How would the Magi use their astronomical skills in a day-to-day situation, helping their emperors or themselves?
Well, this is one of my favorite examples, as a matter of fact. The Babylonians kept very meticulous records of their celestial observations. They would clearly go out every evening, every night, every morning before the sun came up, and they would mark the location of stars. And they did this for decades and decades and decades until they put together an extensive catalog of star locations. As a matter of fact, and this is so cool, I love this part, there is a collection of clay tablets written in cuneiform text that is on display at the British Museum in London. One of these tablets is called the Venus Tablet of Amazaduka.
That's quite the name.
It's quite the name, yes it is. It's from approximately 1500 BC, and it is a record of the heliacal risings of the planet Venus, which means when the planet Venus would pop up above the horizon slightly before sunrise. So it recorded this, year in, year out. And the reason I love this example so much is that this is something that the Magi would have consulted in order to give their daily intelligence briefing to the king.
So they had access to this information that was even older than them, but still very accurate, and they took that into account when they're giving this information to the king.
Absolutely. And why it's so exciting to me is that I believe, frankly, without a doubt, that Daniel literally had his hands on the Venus Tablet of Amazaduka that's currently in the British Museum in London, and that he utilized it to give this intelligence briefing to the king day by day.
I'm fascinated by these guys. Let's talk about what more do we need to know about the Magi that we don't know? Because it feels like there's a lot.
Well, there's a ton of information about these guys. That's part of what is so interesting, is the fact that there's really a lot of historical records about who they are and what they did and what they believe. But let's jump forward to the Persian Empire, because they were the hereditary priesthood of the Medes. Then they served as court advisors to the Babylonians, but then the Persians conquered the Babylonians. They actually continued in the same role. They were court advisors and tutors, et cetera, to the Persian royalty as well.
Tim, this small tribe cornered the market on being the metaphysical advisors.
Absolutely. And then another part of the equation is that the official religion of the Persian Empire was Zoroastrianism.
Okay, let's stop there. Tim, you mentioned Zoroastrianism. I was under the impression that some people thought that the wise men, the Magi, were Zoroastrianism. What is the relationship between the two?
It's really pretty simple. We need to recognize that the Magi actually predate Zoroastrianism. They were already known for their profound spiritual knowledge before Zoroastrianism was a thing. So it's fair to say that they had as much influence on Zoroastrianism as Zoroastrianism had on them. They clearly became Zoroastrians, no question about that, and the Persians made Zoroastrianism the official religion of their realm. But the key point is that they predated it.
The Magi were clearly valued throughout the region for their wisdom and the knowledge that they had, and the Greeks recognized this as well.
Because then, of course, the next step in the equation is now the Greeks conquered the Persians. At this time, the Magi stopped being a singular body like they were under the Babylonians or the Persians, and they tended to be scattered throughout the realm. But the Greeks, they valued this type of knowledge as well. So the Magi started to travel to royal courts all throughout the Greek Empire. So you had Magi in Antioch. You had Magi in Alexandria for sure. You had Magi in Pergamum and places like this. And in addition to that, the Greeks would send their young men to study with the Magi in the East. And this is another one of my favorite examples because we know from historical records, probably a name that everybody out there will recognize, that the Greek philosopher and mathematician Pythagoras was sent to the East to study with the Magi.
Amazing. The influence and the reputation of the Magi continued up until the birth of Christ?
Yes, it did. So very briefly, under the Medes, they were the hereditary priesthood. The Babylonians, they were court officials. The Persians, they were court officials. Then they became Zoroastrians. But then under the Greek, they were somewhat dispersed, but still had this profound knowledge. They would travel to other royal courts and teach there, and then the Greeks would send their children to the East and study with the Magi in the East. So meanwhile, remember our history lesson, there's this breakaway province over on the east end of the Caspian Sea called Parthia, and they are steadily moving from east to west. So what happens is the Magi find their resurgence in the Parthian Empire. They regain their status as a body, not as just being scattered around like the Greeks were. They regain their status as a body, and they still have this dual political, religious role as political advisors. As a matter of fact, under the Parthians, this is really neat. They were one of the first bodies that we know that had something resembling, frankly, a parliamentary system. They had two houses of their parliament, so to speak. One house was the royalty. The other house was known as the House of Megistanes, and it was comprised of the Magi.
The Magi have arrived.
The Magi have arrived, and what's really neat about this is that, and this plays a role in our story, the Parthians did not practice the Rite of Primogeniture.
Which is?
The fancy word that means when the king dies. What primogeniture is that when the king dies, his eldest son becomes king. Now, the Parthians did not practice that. The way the Parthians did it is when the king died, it was the Megistanes who determined who the next king would be.
That's surprising.
Yeah, because what they would do is because, well, think about it for a moment. If the king dies, who is the next legitimate king? Is it his son, or is it maybe the king's brother, or maybe there's some other claim to the throne that really is equally as legitimate? So it was the duty of the house of Megistanes to examine the genealogies and things like that, and they would determine who the next king of the realm would be.
That speaks highly of how they felt about the Magi. But what were the other, it's amazing, but what were some other things that the house of Megistanes did? Well, I know they had additional roles.
Sure, of course. Well, they really had three primary duties, and we've talked about two of them already. We've mentioned all three, so let's summarize.
You're right.
Let's put it together here for people so that they understand. The house of Megistanes had this profound spiritual knowledge. They had a dual religious and political role, but it revolved around three primary responsibilities. Number one, they interpreted dreams, which, as I've mentioned, although we consider that kind of weird today, back then, that was serious scientific knowledge. Likewise, they read the stars. Ditto, okay? Today we might think that's a little weird to base your expectations on what the stars say, but back then that was considered hardcore scientific knowledge. And then finally, their last responsibility was they oversaw royal succession. So dream interpretation, astronomy, royal succession. And what makes that so amazing is we see all three in the nativity story. We see them interpret dreams in light of the fact that when they were traveling to Bethlehem to meet the young child, Jesus, not the baby,
right,
the young child, it says that because of the political intrigue that was going on, Herod was hoping that they were going to report back to him. Remember how it reads in the Gospel of Matthew? That they have this meeting, and then Herod sends the Magi to Bethlehem and says, oh yeah, when you get there, send word, because then I'll come and worship him too. Well, that's not his plan. He's going to send his black ops guys in and try to take him out is what's going on.
Yeah.
But it says that God speaks to them in a dream to return to their home country another way. So right there we see the dream interpretation. Secondarily, well, there's the royal succession. And this is another really key moment, because that's what Jesus is. They show up at the court of Herod the Great, who, by the way, remember, he is a Roman appointee. He is not a legitimate king. He is a Roman appointee, and they show up. Everybody knows who these guys are. It's not some mystery who the Magi are. Everybody knows who they are and what they do. They oversee royal succession. And then they show up at the court of Herod and they say, oh yeah, by the way, where's the real king? And then to top it all off, and this is the part everybody knows, is that the reason they came to begin with is because they said, we saw his star in the east. So back to our tablet of Amazaduka, the Venus tablet of Amazaduka, I believe that that tablet literally recorded what they eventually saw in the stars that led them to Judea, Jerusalem, and Bethlehem to meet the Christ child.